Good afternoon, everyone. May I have your attention, please? Our speaker today is Levi Tillemann, who is the Jeff and Cal Leonard Fellow at the New America Foundation. He is the author of The Great Race, The Global Quest for the Car of the Future, and he combines energy sector knowledge and policy expertise in his writing and analysis. He recently finished a presidential appointment advising the U.S. Department of Energy on policy and international affairs. Dr. Tillemann's analysis has appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, among other publications. He holds a BA from Yale University, an MA and a PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Please welcome our speaker.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming and for having me here. This is actually the first time that I've been to Dartmouth. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, but I was immediately impressed by the quality of our engineering department. We were having some computer troubles, and the Yale man here had no idea what to do, but your Dartmouth engineers fixed it like that. So, I think that bodes well for all of you. So what I'm going to talk about today is my book, The Great Race, The Global Quest for the Car of the Future. And I'm going to start a little bit with the background of where the book came from and how I got into this whole topic of automobiles and innovation and electric cars. In February 2008, I was sitting at Chipotle eating dinner when a phone call changed my life. My father and I had been working together to develop something called the Internally Radiating Impulse Structure, or IRIS engine. It was a smaller, more powerful, more efficient internal combustion engine. And in just a few weeks, we were supposed to receive an award from NASA. Then came the call. My father had been in a car accident, and very unexpectedly, I became CEO of IRIS Engines. Up until then, IRIS Engines was sort of a side project for me. Now, it became an obsession. I saw it as my father's legacy, but also a chance to change the world. I worked harder on IRIS engines than anything I'd ever done in my life, raising money, entering technology competitions, and building a new team. Sometimes I'd go for a week at a time, sleeping only a few hours a night, carefully managing my intake of energy shots to keep from crashing. By 2009, all that work started to pay off. The technology prizes and awards were rolling in, and we'd raised some additional capital. But it wasn't enough. We needed more investment and a customer. So when I scored a meeting with the head of product development for Ford, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was a huge opportunity. I jumped on a plane to Detroit, walked into a dark conference room, and gave the presentation of a lifetime. When the lights came on, Derek Cusack thanked me. He praised our design, and then he told me that the future was in batteries. Case closed. There was no place for the IRIS engine. I was shocked and incredulous. How could he be so certain, I thought. At the time, I didn't take batteries very seriously, but Cusack certainly did. And that's because he knew something that I didn't. Inventors like my father were just one part of what drives innovation in the global automotive sector, a fairly small part. There were much bigger forces at work. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Specifically, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about an institution called the California Air Resource Board, or CARB, a Chinese sea turtle, and a Japanese nuclear engineer called Crazy Anagawa. And I'm going to talk about these three because they show how policy and chance can initiate seismic changes in the largest manufacturing industry on Earth. Understanding these policy drivers is critical for businesses that want to compete in an era of government-led transition from gasoline to electric cars. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the stakes involved in this transition from oil to electricity. They're big. The auto industry is a more than $2 trillion business, filled with companies that are as big as countries. Look at Toyota. It has yearly revenues of over $250 billion. That's more than the GDP of Greece, Ireland, or Qatar, not much less than Israel. And that's just one company. In another example, Tesla Motors has rapidly grown from a business plan scrawled on a few sheets of paper to a $25 billion enterprise. But these numbers actually undersell the importance of the auto sector. From an economic perspective, it's much more than that. That's because the industry also has massive backlinkages throughout the economy. The auto industry stands in stark contrast to something like finance. To run a trading desk on Wall Street, all you need are some fiber optics, a few customers, and a couple of guys and computers. They move a lot of money, but they don't create very many jobs. An auto manufacturer needs thousands of pieces to build a car. Someone has to manufacture those components. Someone has to deliver them. And someone has to assemble and maintain them. That's why $1 of revenue in the auto sector results in $3 for the broader economy. One automotive job translates into 5 non-automotive jobs. It's also important to remember that the auto sector is incredibly technologically sophisticated, managing a vast array of different technologies and a complicated supply chain. To build a car, Nissan's Opama assembly plant mates together 30,000 pieces over the course of 8 hours. That's about 1 piece every 8 seconds. And it's not just nuts and bolts. Modern automobiles are packed with computers, combustion systems, electronics, even explosives. In 2010, GM reminded us of that by pointing out that the Chevy Volt would have more lines of computer code than the US military's cutting-edge jet fighter, the F-35. These complex systems need to survive enormous abuse, scalding heat, freezing cold, punishing roads, and deadly crash forces, all while being easy to use and keeping occupants safe, comfortable, and entertained. It takes an army of engineers to design that car, and another army of engineers to design and maintain the factories that assemble and put it together. Because cars are critical to the modern economy, if a country doesn't build them, it has to import them. And that can be a huge drain on the balance of trade and on foreign currency reserves. But if a country or company can master the art and science of auto manufacturing, the prize can be tens of billions of dollars of exports and many, many jobs. But in order to succeed in the auto sector, it is vitally important for corporations to remember that the kind of cars we drive and how we drive them has a direct impact on energy imports, local pollution, and climate change. Because of this, regulators, generals, and even presidents have to worry about what we drive, what fuels it, and where it is built. There are dozens of countries that manufacture cars, each represented by a slice of this pie chart. But look at those big fat pieces on the right side of the chart. They represent 3 countries. Does anyone have any guesses on what those countries might be? What do you think about the blue one? Hands up there in the center top.
Japan.
So the top one is not Japan, but close geographically. That's China. China is the largest auto manufacturer in the world. The next one is Japan, and then the final 13% slice is the United States of America. Together, they manufacture over 50% of the automobiles in the world. And that's why it's important to understand something about the California Air Resource Board, the Chinese sea turtle, and the Japanese nuclear engineer named Crazy Anagawa. Because these 3 characters explain the relationship between government and industry for over 50% of global automotive production. Let's start with CARB, which is, in many senses, the most powerful and least understood automotive regulator on Earth. To understand CARB, a little historical context is useful. On July 26, 1943, residents of Los Angeles panicked when a thick and noxious haze rolled through the city. No one knew where it came from, so they assumed it was a chemical attack by the Japanese. It wasn't. It was smog, resulting mostly from the evaporation and oxidization of unburnt gasoline pouring out the tailpipes of cars. But it would be another 7 years before California figured that out, when a Dutch chemist called Arie Hagensmit who was a teacher at Caltech, unwound the mystery, he was roundly attacked by the oil industry. But Hagen-Smit fought back, and eventually his breakthrough was accepted as common knowledge. For the next 20 years, he led California's efforts to find a solution. In 1975, California's new governor, Jerry Brown, appointed Tom Quinn to head the California Air Resource Board. He took a much more aggressive approach in pushing clean air technology. He cross-examined automakers and pitted them against each other, trying to understand the outer limits of smog control. He set incredibly tough standards, and the industry struggled to comply. They detested Quinn. But they couldn't just walk away, because California's market was too big. Quinn's tenure set a new tone for CARB, and by 1990, CARB decided to use its market leverage to force automakers to develop a new generation of zero-emission vehicles, electric cars, through what CARB called its ZEV rule. The rule mandated that 2% of cars sold in the state needed to be electric by 1998, and 10% by 2003. If that sounds like a small percentage to you, think again. Electric cars were enormously expensive, and California was talking about making manufacturers sell tens and soon hundreds of thousands of them a year. At first glance, it was draconian. But two policy points explain the why and how of California's ZEV rule. First, many people wonder why California, and not New York or Illinois, had the ability to promote EVs. The answer is that in the 1970s, California was way ahead of the rest of the nation in pollution control efforts. That year, the 1970 Clean Air Act amendments gave the state unique authority to set its own emission standards and also allowed other states to opt into those standards. Many did. This meant that California had the ability to hold massive swaths of U.S. auto sales hostage. California's policy mechanism was also important. CARB realized that the best way to incent innovation was to create a market that rewarded it. So the ZEV rule used what I call synthetic markets to generate the maximum bang for its regulatory buck. The state awarded automakers credits for every electric vehicle they sold and then allowed them to buy and sell these credits among themselves. This allowed automakers to choose for themselves whether it was more economical to build ZEVs or buy credits. The state was still putting enormous pressure on the industry, but it was also giving them the freedom to choose how to comply with the regulations. Every 2 years, California would revisit the regulations and revise portions that didn't seem to be working. Still, by the late 1990s, Detroit was at war with California. Automakers sued to stop California's mandate again and again and again. But at the same time, car makers worked to build and sell electric vehicles. GM claims that it spent over $1 billion developing its EV1. California's ZEV rule sparked a decade of research, investment, and innovation in the industry and set off a global race. The state had leveraged its market power to force global automakers to innovate towards California's clean air goal. So what were the characteristics of California's program that made it the fulcrum of innovation and regulation? First, it controlled a huge swath of the U.S. auto market. Second, it had a long-term strategic plan to force a technology shift towards EVs. Why? It wanted clean air. It not only invited foreign manufacturers to be part of this project, it forced them. Finally, it made automakers compete with each other to sell EVs. But while lots of progress was made between lawsuits, high costs, opposition from the Bush administration, and an industry shift towards fuel cells, California dialed back its mandate. Its goal was still to deploy EVs, but the timeline had been extended. But just as California was starting to slow down in the Great Race, Japan and China started to speed up. In China, this was thanks to a sea turtle named Wangang. I want to talk about sea turtles for a second. They're kind of ingenious creatures. They hatch, swim for thousands of miles, and many years later, they come back across the world's oceans and return to the very beach where they were born to start their own family of sea turtles. That's why Chinese call people who return to China after education or work abroad haigui, or sea turtles. The sea turtle we're going to discuss today is the Minister of Science and Technology of the People's Republic of China, Wang Gang. Very late into his life, few would have predicted Wang Gang's rise to power. For one, Wang was not a member of the Chinese Communist Party. Wang grew up in Shanghai, but as a teenager, he was exiled to a farm in the countryside as part of the Cultural Revolution. There, separated from his family, Wang spent long hours trying to modernize a primitive farming community. He even helped build and design its electrical grid. And it turns out that when you're banished to the countryside as a teenager, there isn't much to do. So Wang developed some interesting hobbies. One of those was spending long hours in the tractor shed, disassembling and reassembling the community's only internal combustion engine, its decrepit tractor. That's how Wang developed a passion for cars. After his exile, he returned to Shanghai to study automotive engineering at Tongji University. He then left China to attend graduate school in Germany. Wang got job offers from each of the major auto manufacturers, but opted for Audi. It was the smallest and most dynamic. Eventually, he ended up in strategy, central planning for the automaker. Secure in his career, Wang began teaching part-time at a local university. But he also had another side job, leading Chinese business delegations and dignitaries through Audi's facilities. One day, he was leading China's Minister of Science and Technology, Xu Guanghua, through the halls of Audi. He pitched an audacious plan to leapfrog the West and Japan into the future of automobiles. Wang told him that China was unlikely to ever catch up to the West in engine technology. But if it ran hard, it could dominate a future of electric cars. The visitor brought Wang's message home to China's leadership, and they did more than just embrace his thesis. Quietly, they ushered the Audi engineer home, and soon they made him president of Tongji University. Finally, they put Wang in charge of the country's secretive 863 program for advanced technology, which is the equivalent of NASA, DARPA, and the National Science Foundation all rolled into one. His goal was to prepare a dazzling display of electric vehicles for the 2008 Olympics. Wang rose ever higher, and when Xu Guanghua retired, they made him Minister of Science and Technology, an unprecedented promotion for someone who was not a member of the party. By the time the 2008 Games kicked off, the country had a fleet of 500 electric vehicles ready to go. This was before the Chevy Volt, Nissan Leaf, or any other mass-produced electric car. To foreign visitors, the Olympic debut was enormously impressive. A couple years later, China staged an even bigger show in Shanghai, Wang Gang's home city. There, GM and SAIC showcased their vision of China's automotive future at the World Expo. And I'm going to share a few minutes of that presentation with you right now. So it was really quite spectacular. You walked in to this huge stadium, and on IMAX screens was projected this image of the future of the Chinese transportation system, their ambition for what China could be in the year 2030. And I'm going to let you watch about 3 minutes of it, and then we'll move on. Okay, so you get the idea. It was a sight to behold, and what made it even cooler is that you strapped into these seats in 5-point harnesses, and they literally flew you through this virtual world of China's transportation future. But it stood in very stark contrast to what was outside. You see here the skies are blue, everything is clean and safe, and in Shanghai on the day that I went to the Expo, the air was almost chewy with soot, and you had these manic waves of cars outside that were very noisy, and you could see that automobiles were a real mixed blessing for the country. But this was China's ambition. But China's approach was very different from California's. For one, its explicit goal was to leapfrog the West and Japan through electrification. Unlike California, it used intellectual property as the price of admission to the EV market for foreigners. Rather than creating a market for innovation, the Chinese government applied political pressure to local governments and companies and handed out big incentives for companies that sold EVs. Now let's move to Japan. The final individual you should know is Takafumi Anagawa, or as I affectionately call him, Crazy Anagawa. Anagawa was a nuclear engineer at the Tokyo Electric Power Company, and his specialty was core safety. He began his career at the Fukushima nuclear complex in Japan's Tohoku region. Some of you may have heard of it. Ever since the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1944, the Japanese have disliked nuclear power. There's a term for this dislike. They call it the nuclear allergy. But Anagawa was very different. He saw nuclear energy as a solution to Japan's dependency on Middle Eastern oil, its environmental problems, and also to climate change. In 2002, lawsuits, obstructionism from the Bush administration, and other factors had brought California's EV experiment to a grinding halt. The rest of the world had been working on EVs to export to California. So from Germany to Yokohama, EV programs were shut down. But Anagawa didn't care. He believed that EVs could convince the Japanese people of the value of nuclear power, so he pushed ahead. But Anagawa needed partners. Still, again and again, automakers turned him down. Eventually, he convinced Subaru and Mitsubishi to join him. Together, they persuaded Japan's powerful Ministry of Economics, Trade, and Industry to back Anagawa's electric vision. This was really the key turning point. TEPCO and its partners knew that they couldn't succeed without METI's support. And when METI threw its weight behind TEPCO, automotive heavyweights like Nissan also joined the race for electrification, lured in by rich incentives. I remember in 2007, at CERAWeek, which is a big energy conference, a Nissan rep proudly announced that they would be introducing an all-electric sedan with a 100-mile range that was, quote, competitively priced with other vehicles its size. No one quite believed him. But that's exactly what Nissan was planning on doing, at the urging of TEPCO and METI. So what are the key points to remember with Japan? First, this was a TEPCO initiative. But even a company as big as TEPCO needed state sponsorship. METI's decision to subsidize TEPCO's consortium and anyone else who joined was the critical milestone. METI's incentives, which amounted to 50% of the incremental cost of an electric vehicle, up to 1 million yen, changed the calculus for players like Nissan and reverberated across the world. So that gets us our three main characters: a nuclear engineer, a sea turtle, and CARB. By 2008, the Great Race was in full swing. Al Gore's climate change documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, had focused the nation, and indeed the world, on clean energy solutions. And skyrocketing prices for oil gave additional impetus. But just as things were starting to heat up in China, Japan, and the US, all three were battered by a series of crises that could have stopped the Great Race cold. I think we all remember what happened in America. In the US, an economic crisis plunged the auto industry into a tailspin. Only massive state intervention salvaged it from complete collapse. The end result was more than $80 billion pumped into the US auto sector. Billions of stimulus money also went towards EVs. Those slugs of cash had very mixed results. On the one hand, the federal government saved GM, Chrysler, and Tesla from oblivion. That paid huge dividends. Joe Biden summed it up by saying that President Obama's 2012 campaign slogan should be, "Bin Laden is dead and GM is alive." It was that important. Tesla was particularly important for EVs. That's because its product changed the perception of electric cars. The Model S was arguably the best car ever built. But beside these successes, there was also a long list of battery and automotive bankruptcies. A123, Fisker Automotive, Think, and the list goes on. Much of that was the result of federal institutions putting unprecedented amounts of money into renewable energy on an extraordinary timescale. This hurried, some would say profligate, crisis-driven spending stood in sharp contrast to California's methodical efforts. In California, the ZEV rule was back. In fact, it was resurrected before the 2008 crisis. California had revived its EV mandate because Anagawa's efforts in Japan had proved that EV technology was ready for consumers. With its aggressive mandate, California was again driving innovation forward. The state didn't spend nearly as much money as the federal government, but its technology-forcing policies were incentivizing massive strategic investments in EVs. By buying and selling EV credits, car companies could earn big revenues. For instance, in the fourth quarter of 2014, Tesla earned $86 million on selling ZEV credits alone. The crisis Japan faced was very different. In March of 2011, I was at another CERAWeek conference in Houston, Texas. The next day, I was supposed to fly to Japan for interviews with TEPCO, METI, and automakers. As I looked up at one of the LCD screens in the lobby, I saw a giant white scythe rolling in from the sea. It was a tsunami. Almost 20,000 Japanese died in the tsunami's waters. Huge swaths of Japan's east coast were destroyed. Infrastructure was devastated, and production facilities for Japan's auto industry were damaged. It also set off the world's worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. Takafumi Anagawa was ordered to abandon his world-leading EV program and help TEPCO battle the raging nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. Japan's automakers were also assaulted by a viciously high yen, as high as 78 yen to the dollar, and large floods in Thailand submerged much of Japan's offshore production facility for cars. In response, Japan's government nationalized TEPCO and pumped huge subsidies and tax breaks into the automotive economy. They specifically targeted hybrids and electrics. Auto sales had plummeted after the tsunami, but with METI's help, they soared. Japan was battered, but it was still in the race. China had largely avoided the global recession, as well as natural disaster. You would expect it to surge in the Great Race, and that's exactly what happened in its traditional auto sector. In 2000, China was producing fewer passenger cars than Spain. But in 2001, it joined the WTO, and auto production surged. Here is a dynamic chart that shows the production of Chinese automobiles, actually both commercial and non-commercial cars, starting in the year 2000. And I want you to just take a look at how China marches up from a position just below the United Kingdom to become the largest automaker in the world. So you can see in the year 2000, America was by far the world's largest auto producer, but it was being gained on by both developing countries and also Japan, which ended up overtaking the United States by 2007. In 2008, all of the developed countries in the world pulled back in terms of their auto production as a result of the recession, but China just kept on going and going and going until the year 2014, where you can see that China is producing as many vehicles as the United States and Japan combined. So this is a dramatic resetting of the table of the global auto industry. I mean, just a huge transformation that nobody quite could have predicted 10 years ago. Here's the same slide in a less dynamic format. It wasn't that ambitions were low in China or that the money wasn't there. In fact, China's sea turtle-in-chief, Wang Gang, promised that his country would build and sell 500,000 electric cars by the end of 2011. That was more aggressive than either the United States or Japan. The central government tried to use political pressure and huge sums of money to push provinces to leapfrog into the future. But in China, what Beijing proposes, the provinces often dispose of. An ancient Chinese proverb says, 山高皇帝远, which means the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. That's shorthand for saying that the provinces pretty much do their own thing. And that's what you saw happen in China. Rather than build a national industry, every province created its own little fiefdom. This resulted in over 50 companies building 50 different models of EV. Local governments were told to buy EVs, but they only bought EVs from local companies, which degraded competition and led to poor quality, high-cost vehicles. Consumer incentives for electric cars were rich, almost $20,000 in some Chinese cities. They were far higher than in the US or Japan. But that wasn't enough. The incentives were wrong, and the business model was unsustainable. None of these companies could make a world-class car, not to speak of a world-class electric car. Although China tried to steal technology from the West and force foreign manufacturers to give up technology as the price of admission to China's automotive market, foreign companies largely decided to pass on China's generous invitation. It was a cost they weren't willing to bear. Rather than 500,000 EVs produced in 2011, China sold fewer than 6,000 electric cars. America's EV market was the largest in the world, but focused almost exclusively on California's ZEV rule states. And Japan was also a leader. Its auto companies produced by far the most EVs in the world, as well as the batteries for the Tesla. So what does all this teach us? For one, it shows us that innovation isn't the kind of lottery many perceive it to be. And it's not just about big ideas or throwing money at things either. The critical element was getting the policy incentives right. And that's because most of the time, these massive transitions don't just happen. All around the world, political leadership is essential to sweeping structural, social, and technological transformations. China, Japan, the US, and Germany still have big plans for electric cars. The question now is one of technological innovation, of course, but also of policy and execution. It's important to remember that this is nothing new. Without the leadership of Washington, rural America would have never been electrified. Nuclear power would still be a pipe dream. The internet and semiconductor might not exist. The roads we drive on would likely end at a figurative city wall, with no highways or rail to unite America's vast interior. And that leadership will also be critical to the Great Race. In some senses, China, Japan, and the US were all contenders to win this first stage of the Great Race. I would say that the main takeaways for competent companies interested in this space are these. Recognize that for now, policy is the foundation of EV markets and deployment, and integrate policy into your innovation strategy. Advocate for government policies that are strategic, with long time horizons, but aggressive and tactically flexible. Understand that the reason for California's success was that clean air policy was not politicized, which allowed for long-term technocratic approaches rather than a political approach. By pushing the benefits of EVs from a number of angles, stakeholders can help make sure that they don't fall prey to politics. If I were giving this presentation 6 months ago, I might leave it here. But I feel that China deserves a coda, because there are promising signs that China may already be recovering from its early failures. In 2013, it released a new set of rules that improved competition and mandated local governments to purchase an escalating percentage of vehicles as ZEVs. At the end of last year, China's ZEV sales surged. In January 2014, China sold only 600 EVs. But by December, China was selling over 15,000 EVs a month. So perhaps China is back in the game. And that's a big deal. Because to be a player, you need to compete in the Great Race. To thrive in a field of 21st century leviathans, China, America, and other countries will have to formulate a more coherent national mission. We will need to renew and re-engineer the building blocks of our economy and politics and evolve into a new industrial species that relies less on oil. Between electric cars and autonomous vehicles, The world is on the cusp of a physical revolution. You all are a critical part of that process, and it's a revolution that could make our roads safe, clean, fast, and efficient, and could free our society from the shackles of oil. We simply need to reach out and grasp it. These changes are part of a much broader transformation in the $70 trillion global economy. But to win the great race, America and others will need to recognize the powerful potential for symbiosis between market and state. Entrepreneurs and corporations animate these sectors, but governments provide the rules for the road and can drive innovation through strategic industrial policy. Corporations and countries must embrace this truth if they are to compete in the 21st century. If they do, it will be better for us and for the world. For at the end of the day, this sprint to build a car of the future is a race we all run together. And this we is not only Americans, Chinese, and Japanese, but all of humanity and life on Earth itself. So the sooner we cross the finish line, the better. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions. Yes?
What would you say to the concept that the future of cars is software-based, driverless cars with hardware being secondary?
Sure. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that we are moving towards a set of systems which are more modular in terms of the hardware side of things, especially when you look at electric cars, batteries. It doesn't necessarily make sense for every automaker to build their own battery factory. It probably makes sense for automakers to procure batteries from experts in that field, and that's one reason why automakers actually really don't like batteries, because that's a huge chunk of the cost of your vehicle. And if you are purchasing that from an external supplier rather than manufacturing it in-house like you would an internal combustion engine, then that's money out the door. One reason automakers like fuel cells is because they can build their own fuel cell stack, and that keeps more of the cost of the car in-house. And so I think that batteries, electric motors, inverters, all of these systems are much more amenable to a plug-and-play type approach than you would find for the systems in a traditional automobile. So I think that's a really good point. Yes?
You just touched on something that I was going to ask, which is, why do we see a resurgence of enthusiasm among automakers for fuel cells?
Well, automakers, I think it's two automakers. And part of it is what I just said. It's Toyota and Honda are really excited about fuel cells. And I just wrote an article about this. I honestly do not understand fuel cells as a business proposition or consumer product in the short to medium term. They just don't make any sense. The infrastructure is enormously expensive. The hydrogen has to come from natural gas, which means that you're not getting much of a greenhouse gas benefit. Maybe you're getting a clean air benefit because all they produce is water, and really that's the only thing that comes out of the tailpipe of a fuel cell. But yeah, you have to build all these fuel cell refueling stations. You have to get hydrogen from somewhere, probably natural gas, which means that you're not going to have a much better GHG footprint than a hybrid electric vehicle would have that runs off of gasoline. And then you, as a consumer, you have to be able to fill it up somewhere. I spent a morning with Toyota's Mirai fuel cell vehicle, which is supposed to come out later this year. And I was kind of stunned to realize that the car only goes 150 miles if it's filled at a 300-bar filling station, which is the kind of most popular kind of hydrogen filling station. I think there are only 11 hydrogen filling stations in the whole country, so that doesn't say too much. But if you fill it up at a 700-bar fueling station, which is much more expensive, it goes a whopping 300 miles, which is fully 30 miles more than the Tesla Model S. So I don't see the benefit. Also, it drives like, not quite like a Prius, but certainly not like a Tesla, and it only seats 4 people. So it's not a great product. And I feel bad because I really like the people at Toyota, and I think they're very smart, and I think that they have a great deal of vision, in that they're willing to invest in these kind of long-term technology plays, which is, by the way, what I think fuel cells are. I think fuel cells might actually be a very good solution 20 years from now if we can find a better place to get the hydrogen, right? Or if we can find a really good way to use renewable energy to create, zero carbon hydrogen. But barring that, it's a really tough sell. And, by the way, completely dependent on massive, massive policy incentives. Yes, in the blue shirt.
So that's a nice segue. How much have you thought about how clean electric cars really are? Because electricity has to come from someplace too. And when you think about the U.S., for instance, there's coal and other means.
Right.
On average, is it really cleaner?
Yeah, I wake up every day and I think about that. But I actually do think about it a lot, and it's kind of a hard. It's a hard set of issues to confront if you're looking at things in the short term, because there are a lot of costs going into producing the battery. We do have a fair amount of coal in our system today. Most of the calculations that I've seen still say that electric vehicles today are cleaner than even a hybrid electric vehicle, even if you run them on a fairly coal-heavy system. But the real promise of electric cars is that 10 years from now, as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner, which is, by the way, exactly what it's doing. You have a lot more wind, a lot more solar, and a lot more natural gas coming into our generation system. If you look at that system of 10, 20, 30 years from now, which is increasingly very low carbon, then electric vehicles can be very, very clean indeed. But it's important to keep this kind of life cycle analysis in mind as you're designing cars, as you're charting the policy that applies to cars. And these are the kinds of questions we should be asking. Yes?
In your analysis of the life cycle, do you include the manufacturing cost and attendant pollution that comes with it?
Yeah, I think you have to, right? Yes, sir, in the front row here.
Two things. First, there is a lot of hydrogen in water as a source of hydrogen.
Right.
Secondly, what about ammonia as storage for hydrogen?
Well, I don't know that much about ammonia as storage for hydrogen, but the problem with the hydrogen in the water is you have to get it out of the water somehow. And the way that you do that is through electrolysis. And electrolysis is enormously energy intensive. And so that means you're either plowing huge amounts of renewable energy.
At the moment.
Right, so that's that. Yeah, so if you can find a good way to get hydrogen, then fuel cells all of a sudden become a lot more attractive. But right now they're still pretty challenged.
Use nuclear.
Sorry?
Use nuclear energy.
Right, so nuclear is another option, but it's also very controversial, and you have to get around those issues and those politics. But the other thing that people say, and from the numbers I've seen, kind of makes sense, is that it's a much more efficient use of the electricity from a nuclear power plant to just charge an electric car than it is to go and perform electrolysis on water and then transport that hydrogen to somewhere and build a new filling station and then use that to fuel your hydrogen powered vehicle at say 75-80% efficiency. It's just a much better use of capital and energy to go electric straight away rather than using a hydrogen fuel cell. But there are a lot of different pathways, and maybe one of those pathways will open up. And I know a lot of engineers love hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. I found that there's something that really appeals to engineers. So, next question. Yes?
What do you think the prospects are for the sale of Chinese cars in the U.S. in the next, say, 5 to 10 years? Conventional cars.
That's a really good question. I think that the prospects are kind of dubious. It's really hard to meet all of the environmental and safety standards that we require of our vehicles in this country. And, you can go buy a Korean car that's pretty cheap and pretty high quality and meets all of those standards. And I think we're going to have a hard time, the Chinese are going to have a hard time competing with that and getting up to the level that we require for the U.S. market. It's possible. 5 years, maybe 5-10 years, you'll start to see some Chinese autos in the U.S. But what most people don't realize is that 85-90% of the cars sold in China are actually built with foreign technology. They're the product of these joint ventures between Toyota, Nissan, General Motors, other Western companies and Chinese companies. And the reason for that is that if the Chinese didn't produce the cars internally, they would have to import them, but they couldn't produce quality cars themselves without foreign technology. And so the solution was to marry up these foreign companies with the domestic manufacturers and then use that as kind of a profit-sharing mechanism. And so even the Chinese cars that are produced today, even though they're produced in massive volume, mostly use foreign technology. One phrase that you hear people banter around is that the Chinese auto industry is big but not strong. Yeah, it's kind of... Yes?
Isn't the real tripping point for electric vehicles the energy storage, the battery? It seems to me all of the, you show the video, you look at the futuristic thing, and I see this nice little vehicle flying around, I'm thinking, what's powering that thing? Just to drive that, it's got to take a battery that's bigger than what it is. So it seems to me like we're not all driving electric vehicles, number one, partly because the battery technology is very bad.
Well, I think range is definitely an issue, but those vehicles actually did exist. They had vehicles that looked exactly like them at the Shanghai World Expo. They just couldn't go very far and they couldn't go very fast. Now, batteries have gotten a lot better since then. In 2008, it cost about $1,000 for a kilowatt hour of battery capacity. Today, it costs about $300 for a kilowatt hour of battery capacity, and batteries are getting more energy dense, which means that you can put more battery into a smaller place, or more energy into a smaller place as well. The trends in the industry, I would say, are very good. Tesla is building this gigafactory in Nevada, which is going to produce the same volume of batteries as all of global battery manufacturing combined did in 2013. And that's going to be online by 2018. And they believe that they're going to be able to bring down battery costs by about 30 to 40%. And so, yes, batteries are definitely a problem. Yes, they're definitely a sticking point, but they're also definitely moving in the right direction. And that's just with technology that we know is going to work today. There's so much research and development going into batteries right now. It would kind of be surprising if something didn't stick. It would kind of be surprising if we don't have some sort of a breakthrough in the next 10 or 15 years. Yes?
You mentioned that EVs are like modules in nature, so it's better to outsource many of their things like batteries and other companies who just do that much better. So in future, if the EV cars do happen, where do you think the revenue for Honda or Toyota will come from? Because a large part of what they do actually can be done much better by the other companies.
Well, so they'll build some of the systems, and they also procure a lot of their materials from outside suppliers as is, right? So it won't be a total sea change. You look at the BMW i8. They produce their own motors, they buy their batteries, they produce their own inverters, and so you can produce some of these components in-house, but probably it's not efficient to produce all of them in-house. And so it will just be an evolution, and it will be a new model, and automakers are going to have to negotiate those waters.
Is anybody thinking about the old streetcars that you could run power lines or power whatever strips down freeways, and so you have your own battery operated, but you hook it onto a freeway and you go hundreds of miles and then you go off?
Yeah, that's one way to do it. I think it all just comes down to costs, and if you can come up with a system that is economical enough that we're willing to make that investment, and then you can get the automakers bought in, or you can regulate them into becoming a part of that system, then that is definitely one option. Another option is there's actually wireless charging capability now, and so people have looked at perhaps installing wireless chargers at stoplights, so that when you stop in the middle of the city, you're getting a charge every time you sit at that stoplight for 1 or 2 minutes. which is another way to sustain or increase the distance that batteries can go. And then there are also just fast chargers, which are these, they call them level 3 chargers. They operate at a much higher level of voltage than your standard EV charger, and you can get maybe 80% charge in about 15 to 20 minutes. And if you're doing that on a 100-mile battery, you're rarely going to need any more than first, you're rarely going to need to charge in a day. You might need to charge one out of every 15 to 20 days, right? Maybe not out here in New Hampshire, but in most urban environments. But yeah, I mean, that is another option. There are lots of different ways that you can deal with these problems. Yes?
You just mentioned car in urban environments, which are basically a very bad idea. Nelson's comment leads to a logical thinking, which is that the car is not really the solution for the transportation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that that's a good point, and a lot of people would share your perspective, and it's also going to be very, very difficult to tell people that they can't have their car anymore. So, I mean, I think that if we could, like, look at me. I'm a single guy, but I have a dog, and I can't bring my dog onto public transportation. So I have a car. I wouldn't have a car otherwise. And when you have kids, it's really a lot harder to take your kids on the bus or on the subway than it is to just pile them into a car. And so I think the way that we have engineered our society and our cityscapes in this country make them kind of hostile to non-vehicular transportation. But we hopefully will evolve towards a less vehicle-centric mode of urban planning in the future. Yes?
One thing you don't really hear about is, even rechargeable batteries don't last forever. What are the environmental and cost impact of disposing of them? That's got to happen at some point.
That's another great question. So, because so much of the focus and so much of the justification for electric vehicles is environmental, most of the automakers who are working on electric vehicles have been thinking about these issues from day one. So Nissan, for instance, they started a whole separate company that is completely dedicated to recycling batteries. And the idea is that once they reach, I think, about 70% of their capacity, then you will remove the battery from the electric vehicle and you'll use it for storing renewable energy. And that will, that will remain useful until the battery degrades to maybe 30% storage or 20% storage. And once that happens, then you'll recycle the remainder. And say the battery is 80-90% recyclable, you will still have some waste, but it will have lived a very long and productive life.
One more question, if there is. Well, I have one. Considering the rapid growth of vehicles on the roads in China, two questions. One, does their strategy presently require them to make the spare parts to keep the material, the cars going, and are they building roads? In other words, if they're not, the growth rate is going to slow down.
Right. Well, the growth rate is already slowing down, and one of the reasons it's slowing down is that they are reaching the physical limits of the number of vehicles that society can support. They're building roads like crazy. If you go to China, there is so much concrete in that country. Like you will be amazed. It's worse than Houston, and and in cities like Beijing or Shanghai, the pollution has gotten so bad that what they've done is they've started to dramatically restrict the number of license plates that they're issuing, which also restricts the number of new cars that are being sold. And so the Chinese have now started proactively throttling automotive sales for those kinds of issues because of air quality and also energy security concerns. And so I think that China will probably continue as the largest automotive market in the world for the foreseeable future, but some of these wild projections of growth that you've seen, in industry or from various consultancies, which say that China is going to be selling 40+ million cars a year by 2025, I just don't see that happening. I don't think it's sustainable, and I think that China is working assiduously to make sure that there are other options for transportation within and between its cities. So anyway.
I will bring that discussion to a close. If you have more questions, I invite you to speak with Levi, and thank you very much for very
Thank you.